First of all, I'd like to thank Hakan very much for this invitation and for organizing this conference on finance. The topic here, why did finance professionalize? You'll notice it's 1550 to 1750. So I'm taking this early period because I think there's certainly enough to say about it. And it's also an area that I know much better. I'm not very well prepared to talk about finance in the 20th century, certainly. And then I add, or not, because as most of us know, the what at least most economic historians would call professionalized finance is very much caught up with the notion of corporate banking. And while certainly the beginning of corporate banking Europe-wide is something that's very important to study, what I'm going to be talking about is that period before large-scale corporate banking happened in northwestern Europe. So to begin here, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think sort of the state of the question is as far as early modern finance. First of all, I'd say that what I'm going to be talking about, professionalized finance, does not refer simply to bank credit. We're not talking about just credit. We're talking about the various financial products that were very important in this period, began in this period. And among those things are joint stock, for example, and insurance, those kinds of items. And they're not usually called credit. You can kind of move them around a little bit and say, well, the corporation was getting some kind of credit or whatever, but generally we don't use the term credit to refer to them. So we're looking at finance in its broader aspect. I think there's general agreement that plenty of credit was out there and did not retard industrial development. I think for those of you that work in this, I think many of your papers, in fact, were making this point that this is not, that there's credit out there. We shouldn't think that you have to have a corporate bank in order to have it. Most of the credit did not issue from private banking institutions or from the government. And then I would say that there is the whole issue of information gap, which Phil Hoffman and his colleagues have talked about extensively, and that is often identified as the major problem as far as getting a corporate bank and a centralized place involved in credit. So, in other words, a centralized bank or an urban bank would have trouble knowing in a locality whether there was corporate, whether the person that was applying for a loan was creditworthy, and whether the property, often mortgage, often land, was used as collateral, that there were no property encumbrances on that in the absence of things like title deed companies and the kinds of things that one goes through today in making sure that whatever land one's buying is not encumbered, or the bank being sure that it's not encumbered. So most of this research, or much of it, has really taken place in response to economic historians who stressed that corporate banking, that was really the beginning of credit. And of course that corporate banking model, which this research that I'm talking about here has been reacting to, is also part of a kind of Rostovian model of economic change, which gives a primacy to the Industrial Revolution. And one of the things that I will want to be talking about is kind of a reaction to that in terms of economic change also, particularly as it has to do with finance. So if this is sort of the state of the question, I'm going to then talk to you about what I see as sort of at the end of this keynote that I hope that you want to be thinking about. And I'm telling you to at the beginning so that you can be sort of thinking about it as I'm talking. So where I'm trying to get to at the end, more or less, is first of all to seriously consider that the financial innovations promoted by merchant communities during the 17th century should be recognized as the origins of the Western financial system and its global dominance. In other words, I'm going to argue that if you look at some of the innovations that the merchant communities, and when I say merchant communities here, we're talking about overseas or long distance merchant, the ones that controlled or were very important in running cities such as Amsterdam and London and Hamburg and before Antwerp, before it had its demise with the ambitions of the Habsburgs. This group, I think, sometimes gets, I don't know, minimized in certain economic histories that go over the long durée, and I think it's important to look at that. So I'm going to start with that when we talk about credit. Then also, rather than associate representative government with central banking, in other words, the notion that that the reason that we had central banks is that there were revolutions or changes that instituted a sort of parliamentary system, and this protected property rights. This particular argument is one associated with Douglas North and Barry Weingast, in an article that also many of you that wrote papers know very well or cite in your papers. This particular argument, which has been critiqued quite a bit, is one that I would say really just making a slight really change to what they're talking about, that the problems of central banking and the fact that they don't develop, it doesn't develop, in other words, there aren't more banks of England or Riksbanks like you had in Sweden, or Amsterdam. All of these, some of these banks had different functions, but they were kind of centralized banks. The problem with them has often been associated, the problem of other countries establishing these kinds of banks has often been associated with the notion that they didn't have parliamentary representative government. What I would say is the problem is more, just kind of flipping it slightly, is that they had more absolutist monarchies, and that those kinds of regimes and those dynasties, those particular dynasties, had absolutely no interest in having central banks. That's the way I would put it, rather than the way that, rather than putting the stress on parliamentary representative government and all the rest, because you can have lots of things that stop people, kings, from being absolutist. It isn't just parliaments. Another thing that I'd like you to think about as I talk is this question about the information gap, which I certainly agree with, that more urban banks or banks that weren't in a locality, that they would have problems knowing about the creditworthiness of the households that might be applying for loans. But I think it goes both ways, and this of course has to do with my current research, which is looking at mass, the very slow progress towards mass literacy and numeracy in sort of the Atlantic world. And what strikes me about the period I'm talking about has to do with the very limited proportion of people whose skills in writing and numeracy were strong, small numbers, and that this was a big problem in getting people into banking, into taking out bank accounts as well. In other words, it's kind of a two-way um, uh, bad connection. Another thing that I'm going to be talking about a little bit, which also has to do with household and peer-to-peer lending, is the neolocal marriage system in Northwestern Europe. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term. But I'd say for about 40 or 50 years in demography, demographic history, the Northwestern model of families, and it's the basic idea that when you get married, you leave your parental home and start a new home, and that has certain economic stresses connected with it, as opposed to a larger system, say maybe a Chinese family system, where that is not quite the way things operate, and it causes certain economic problems at a certain point, and that this is very much connected, it seems to me, with these loans, these household loans. So that's another concept here. One of the themes in this conference has to do with what has come to be called payment deferred debt. That's when you went to the shop and you got your goods and they put you down in the account book, or they simply put you down on a chalkboard, or they made an oral agreement, and you went off with your goods and you were going to pay them. And of course, the tradesman had that same kind of situation, where he was more often he than she, but sometimes she. Also, the goods that they had were goods that they had gotten on credit from a wholesaler. So it was a two-way. Most of the deferred debt payment situation was that kind of a situation, and it was the most troubled. That was the biggest pitfall in many ways, was in this particular kind of transaction. And this is where you get things like debtor's prison, or a lot of the denizens of debtor's prisons, and also court actions that like Craig Muldrew has talked about. The kind of enforcement of that is a problem area, and I think it needs a lot more research. So we'll be mentioning that as well. Finally, what I'm interested in has to do with trying to put this together in some way or another. In other words, taking this actually as a financial system. And to help us with that, we're going to look at a visual here. This is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the idea of, with the Indian parable about the blind men and the elephant. Is that not no one? Okay, well, I'm not the best to tell this story, but it's just simply that the blind men come and they're presented with an elephant, and one is looking at the trunk, and one is looking at the tail, and one is looking at the middle parts or whatever, all different parts of the elephant. And they're asked to describe the elephant, and each individual, each of the blind men, describes a different part of the elephant as if it's the whole elephant. Now, I'm not suggesting that the people that do research on these different topics are blind men by any means. It's just simply that when you're going to do a research topic, you have to zero in if you're going to really study it properly. And so you, in a certain way, you can think of it, you have blinders, which all of us in all of our research have to do. You have to kind of take out the static and the things around it and zero in on what your objective is. So here we're trying to get around the blind men and the elephant and look at the whole elephant, and that means we're going to have to talk about each of the parts. So here's our elephant, and the first kind of part that I want to pay attention to here is the head. And what I have done here, not done a very crude percentage amounts associated with this based on an inventory samples of Worcestershire and of London, East London actually, around in the 1720s. And I have attributed out of the probate, out of about 480 probate records, weighted, of course. Worcestershire is weighted like 90%, and East London is weighted 10%. I tried to put that together for England. And this is, of course, an Anglo elephant. There would be a Low Countries elephant, and actually more a Dutch Republic elephant, a Flanders elephant. It would vary, just like there's African elephants and there's Asian elephants. So this is one around the 1720s, and these are the shares of credit, just doing this really crude manner of putting it together from probate inventories. And they are not, by the way, so Håkon, don't be too censorious with me. They are not age corrected. That is, these are older. These are mostly older people, and the effect that would have is that probably this would be smaller. These two would be smaller, and this one would be bigger. But at any rate, these are just kind of crude measurements in order to make a point, which is here I'm going to be talking about this as an extremely important part of this elephant, even though it's a small part in terms of the pounds sterling or krona or whatever measurement you would want. And I say that I think it's an important part because this is the merchant community and the products which the merchant community put forward. And they put forward, if you want to ask, why did finance professionalize? And I would argue that it was that the merchant community finance, by the end of the 17th century, was really had so many financial products that later evolved, but were founded in more or less in the 17th century in places like Amsterdam and in London, that one really can say it's professionalized, even though you still have merchants, these overseas large merchants, who are doing both trade in commodities and also doing what we would call some banking functions. Not all of them are doing banking functions, but some of them are doing banking functions. And then there are more professionals, cashiers, money change, whatever group money exchangers, and private banking that specializes with merchants doing the specialized banking as well. So you have this group that are doing banking functions. Now the products that I'm talking about are that bankers, that these merchants are involved with, are creating things like joint stock. There are, of course, two enormous companies that are set up with joint stock, but they're a tip of the iceberg. Those two big companies would be the English East India Company and the VOC, which was the Dutch East India Company. But in addition to those, over the course of the 17th century, you have large numbers of, some which fail, but large numbers of other companies, the Royal African Company, the Hudson Bay Company, And there have been a group of scholars, and Carlos and her group of researchers who have worked on this. There's been work on Anne Murphy, who has done work on in the 1690s and the way that there is all of the secondary markets and the put and call kinds of activities, and even market makers people talk about. And the work that's been done on this over the past couple of decades, I think, has really made the point that these are very professional kinds of activities that are being done. And why are they being done? Because merchants, it's a advert, they are avoiding risk by these joint stock companies. To be able to actually go over to China and to go over to Spice Islands, to go over to all of these areas would is very would is too expensive, and you had to keep what they called factories there. They were which were really trading posts. They had to have forts. There was large numbers, as many of you know all this. I don't want to go on in detail. That was very, very expensive. So this was these joint stock companies that were formed in is beginning in the early 17th century, and there's a whole list of them for England that Ted Rabb did years ago, and but more recently there's been doing very close work that shows the economic sophistication of these markets. It's very small, however. The numbers of people that are contributing to this are relatively small, but not small amounts, and it's very centralized. So while I'm saying that it's 7% of this credit elephant, this Anglo credit elephant here, for my East London people, it's 53% of their financial assets in their inventories. 53% were in the 1720s were in joint stock. Now you might say, those of you that know what happens in the 1720s is it's not the typical decade. That is that this is one of the bubbles. There's a slight bubble in the 1690s. There's another very devastating bubble in the 1720s having to do with trading in these stocks, which were connected with the government securities as well, making them extra problematic. And of course there was a very big problem in France over this that set things back as far as professionalization rather dramatically. However, for the groups that really invested in this, most of them kept their investment because they were connected with this, government securities. This is the other thing, is that there's a very close connection between this business community kinds of stocks and bonds and the government stocks and bonds. And there was a lot of equity for debt. You know, in other words, exchanging. You get some stock in a company, and then that takes care of you put money in, and that helps the public debt, because this government securities area was extremely troubled, much more troubled than the trading companies in this period, and it was troubled because the dynastic houses, most particularly the ones the Bourbons in France, and even more the Habsburgs in both Spain and in Austria and the empire there, were at war all the time, and they built up huge debts. And the reason for a lot of the push that merchants had, because merchants here are the ones that are pushing things, the reason that they get involved is that with some kind of banking, and some of them are fighting with each other as to who's going to get the power to use these public funds, as you have in England. But the reason that they want to do this, and they're really pushing, these merchant communities are pushing for banking having to do with the kings of their countries, because the history of medieval and early modern histories, one sees the carcasses of merchant bankers all over. That is, these are loans that kings would take out with merchant bankers, not within a central bank, but merchant bankers, individual banking families and merchant banks. And they would act with impunity, as one recent dissertation that has characterized it. They simply would say, oh, sorry, can't do it. And they're the ones with the army. They would debase the currency. They would create some, as the Bourbons did, they would create a hearing board that would accuse the merchants of some kind of fraud. They would act with impunity, and this was a very big problem for the merchant community. So the merchants here are an impetus, ultimately, for some other system, or getting rid of the king, as in the case of England. Finally, I don't want to leave the merchant community without mentioning insurance. Because one of the things that went on during these wars, or kind of the preludes to the wars, was a lot of piracy, or as the English preferred to call it, privateering. And this was a great problem for merchants. And insurance came in the late 17th century, marine insurance. And this is, of course, Lloyd's is the most famous, but they operated not out of the incredible building that I recently saw in London, but they operated out of coffee houses, and this was true not just in England but elsewhere. And of course, marine insurance did not really just begin with Lloyd's. That's again too Anglo-centric. But in Antwerp, for example, there's been work done on these brokers, and insurance in this period was not. There were some later joint stock insurance companies, and most of them had to do with fire insurance in the 18th century. But most of the marine insurance was done by brokers, just as actually Lloyd's is still Lloyd's for high risk insurance is a brokerage. It deals with syndicates, and so that was how it was in the 17th century. You get investors, underwriters, a pool of underwriters to handle marine insurance. But this was another. Again, it's this merchant community that is pushing or showing the need, and people stepping up to answer that need in terms of financial products. So what I've talked then about here is both the public and the merchant part of finance, and they're very close in this period. They're very close. They didn't necessarily get along with each other, but they're very close, because you get people in the merchant community sometimes. Excuse me. Sometimes they are not, as we think, generally merchants. They're part of a livery company like the Goldsmith banks that a lot has been discussed on, but they're in this together, and their exchange of stock. So you get in the 18th century, you'll read in probate inventories about old South Sea annuities. And this was part of this debt equity exchange, where you supposedly you had some bank stock, or you had some bank debt, and it was exchanged for stock in what was supposed to be a great trading company. South Sea Company, of course, wasn't that great a trading company, but it had a lot of annuities connected to it. And out of this, of course, also was finally the Bank of England. And when I'm counting the Bank of England, it's up here because it was a joint stock company. It was private. It was not really, but of course, it was, its main purpose was to lend money to the uh, to the uh, to the crown for their adventures, military adventures. Uh, so it's this whole area, which is, I'm calling this the heart of the elephant, because it's the money then that and what becomes cashless money, which is another innovation of this period, coming from the merchant community across all of northwestern Europe. This is the development of not having to use coins, and that was yet another element. Not having to use coins and having constant turnover in exchange, rather than settling it all at fairs. The old system was to go to fairs in Lyon or in Lubeck or Hamburg or some Antwerp area, and settle your, every so often people would gather, merchants would gather and exchange their bills with one another. That comes to an end in the largely to an end in the 17th century. Not that the fairs don't continue, but that them those fairs being not only for commodities but also for financial assets getting traded. That system is dissolving, and instead it is in these individual entrepôts where you get groups of cashiers, and depending on the country, um, and merchant bankers that are handling this kind of activity. Okay, so I would argue that this, while this isn't a big percentage in anybody's inventory, I would argue that that it is kind of what keeps much of the rest of this going, because it's here with the government is the one that sets the interest rates, which don't, many of you mentioned, don't change very much, and when they do change, particularly from the later 17th century on, when they do change, even this other part of the elephant changes with them. In other words, there's not enormous amounts of difference. Now, some would say, well, that's a real problem because you should, particularly for this back end here, like credit cards today, your credit card interest, I don't know what it is out in Sweden, but I can tell you in the United States, it's about 4 times what interest rates are for anything else. Credit card debt. You put it on your credit card and you miss a month, it's not good, is it? No. So this is where you'd think it would be higher here, but in fact, it's not even clear. It's very hard to ever determine if there's any interest being done with it. So anyway, this is the head and the heart, and small percentages, but this has an influence over this. And the cashless, the non-copper, silver, gold kinds of coins, all of getting away from having to deal with any of that or to wait for to use it. This new cashless system that is handled either by private banks or by, in some cases, central banks, as in Sweden, that is very important for this part of the elephant too. So then just let's talk about this part of the elephant, because I think many of you have written about this part of the elephant, and this is kind of private banking that really falls into kind of maybe 3 categories. One category is the group that deal mainly just with the merchant community and are part of this clearinghouse system. And that would be, I think, probably the case with most of the Lombard Street goldsmiths in London, for example. That is the group that deals with the merchants. Then there is the private banking and the ones that actually turned out to be more long-lived, like Child's Bank and Hoare Bank in London, and there's probably some other examples elsewhere. And that was the ones that dealt uh, with the gentry in England, which was a fairly rich group, but was also always building houses or doing things that meant that they needed money. So there was a group of goldsmiths banks that did that, and also some scriveners that were involved in that bank, in that kind of banking. And mortgages were often a very important part of collateral there. It started out with the goldsmiths bringing your plate to them and metals, and then it went off to this kind of more and more towards mortgages. And as some of you talk about, sometimes it went off to what was called a general mortgage, which meant everything you have. And that was an old concept that you can find in at least the late medieval period that Daniel Smale has talked about for southern France. So this is really a very big part of the elephant. And it's this informal kind of, to some extent, informal type of borrowing as well. And the biggest part of it is probably that kind of informal, that where you simply have a scrivener or a notary that is dealing with the bringing together borrowers and lenders, and often in the countryside. Finally, this is the back end of the elephant, and it is a very big part of it, and this is the deferred payment. And it's this very troubled part that is, as I said, very problematic even today. And what I think, one of the things that I think has come out of research in this area is how punitive missing payments could be. In some ways, it was the most hard to enforce. And what appears to happen, at least, and most of this is based on English work, although there's some reference in, as I said, in Daniel Smale's recent book on plundering, and also by Elise Dermeneur, about court action and the creation in the 17th century, at least in England, of these courts, specialized courts to handle this problem. And the increased use, again, this would be based heavily on England, and you can read about it in Tawny Paul's paper, looking at the problem of debtor's prison. And it's usually thought that debtor's prison was some place that you put somebody for a week or two until their relatives really understood that they needed to bail them out or get them out, pay the dues. And that was, I think, the concept behind debtor's prisons. But if Tawny finds that sometimes people had to stay there for over a year. And this got to be a real problem. And the other problem is the numbers of people. And they're not just a general reflection of the population. In these debtors' prisons, they seem to be overwhelming these tradesmen, the shopkeepers, the artisans, and presumably some of their customers. So it's that group that, and of course, the problem, if your customers don't pay you, then how are you going to pay the wholesaler that gave you the stock for your business, whether it's an inventory or whether it's artisanal kinds of activities. Okay, so let me, that's kind of the elephant. Is that, did you get point here? Okay, and these are all influenced, the back end and the private informal is very much connected also with uh, the head here. I guess I have to go back here. Okay, so let me just end up here telling you how I think these points are connected to uh, what I think are important things to study in the future. First of all, and I think I've made the point probably strong enough, that to consider the financial innovations of the long distance merchant community and their impact on these financial products like the joint stock insurance, cashless uh, exchanges. And that's had an effect on the whole system. Uh, the punitive, the acting with impunity activities of the uh, era of the monarchies and the dynasties, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, etc. Uh, that is really something that I think is the one of the impediments to getting a central banking, because they really like to work with more one-on-one merchant houses. Now, it might be a succession of one-on-one merchant houses, but I don't think they had a lot of interest in setting up central banks. And if you look at all of the examples, when is John Law able to do something, which turned out rather disastrously? In France, for example, it's when there is a regency, when Louis XV is about 5 years old. And then what is the situation? When does Sweden get a Riksbank? It's during a time of some turmoil, their political turmoil. Same thing with the Bank of England. Amsterdam, it's when they get rid of the Habsburgs.